הדוברת הבאה, עורכת הדין אן הרצברג, שוב משפטנית, היועצת המשפטית של ארגון NGO Monitor, למרות שבדרך כלל אני תומך בישראל בשמות בעברית, ניטור מלכ"רים לא נשמע במיוחד מושך כמו השם NGO Monitor. כאמור, הרצברג, היועצת המשפטית של הארגון, משפטנית, בוגרת בית הספר למשפטים המפורסם של אוניברסיטת קולומביה, עבדה לפני הצטרפותה לארגון במשרד עורכי דין גדול בניו יורק, וכן עבדה עבור בית הדין הבינלאומי שעסק בנושא רואנדה. עורכת דין הרצברג, בבקשה.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Dr. Sané spoke about in his very interesting presentation that the media acts as gatekeepers and filters, and NGOs are the sources. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that also today. However, I'm going to take a more critical approach and present some reasons why I think that the media is actually not fulfilling that role, why that is, and some manifestations of that. Indeed, there is a significant prominence of NGO materials in the media. It ranges from quotes from NGO officials to recitations of press releases from NGOs, NGO reporting, NGO claims, legal claims, military claims. However, these citations to this type of source material is often not delved into in a very deep way or in a very analytical way in the media. Rather, it's just sort of these blind recitations. Now, why do I think that's a problem, and what is causing that problem? Primarily, I think the thing driving this phenomenon, and I'm going to show you several examples of it, is what we call at NGO Monitor the halo effect. And that is where human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations, they have this aura of altruism around them. And as a result, the claims that they make and the documents that they produce are not given the same type of scrutiny as government sources or other types of international organizational sources, because they're deemed to be, because of this sort of cloak of morality, they're deemed to be more credible. They're not deemed to be motivated by interests like some of these other entities might be. And it also insulates them from any scrutiny as well. Now I'm going to, in the presentation, everyone's going to be talking about the apartheid poll today. But one manifestation also of this halo effect is that, actually before I go into that, one manifestation of that is that when the media does do reporting on NGO stories, they don't delve deeply into the political agendas or narratives that are being promoted by that organization. And as we do know, these types of organizations also have their own interests, their own agendas, and their own politics that they're trying to advocate, and these are often not picked up in the stories. And the apartheid poll is a great example of that. So here you have the headline we also just saw in the last presentation from Haaretz, in both English and in Hebrew. And this story spread like wildfire around the international media. I did a quick search, Motzei Shabbat, last week, and found there were over 310 news articles that picked up this story. And the headlines are pretty inflammatory from around the world. Israeli Jews support apartheid-style state. Israeli poll finds majority in favor of apartheid. Is Israel an apartheid state? A majority of Jews say yes, and on and on and on. Now, what's amazing about these articles is none of them really did a critical analysis of the actual poll questions. They pretty much seem to either rely upon Gidon Levy and Haaretz's spin on this poll, and what I think they were also relying on was a press release put out by the organization that conducted this poll. That organization was the Yisrael Goldblum Foundation, run by a man named Amiran Goldblum, who's a professor of chemistry at Hebrew U, former co-founder of Peace Now. And he issued a very lengthy press release in Hebrew. I don't know how widely disseminated this press release was, or if it was also issued in Hebrew. I've only seen an English version of it. But in any event, these were the headlines, as you can see here. Jews will support apartheid, the poll findings, and an analysis of this poll. However, if you actually looked at the questions of the poll, and many critiques have come out since this article was released, actually showed that most of the poll questions and the results said the opposite of what these findings were. But rather than relying on going to the source, the journalists, rather than going to the source of the questions, and again, I've only seen, a few were printed in English in Haaretz, but the poll in its majority, I've only seen a version of it in Hebrew, so I have my doubts that anyone in the international media actually looked at the original poll questions, but simply they were relying on this interpretation by Amiran Goldblum and his organization. And also in that press release, it made a very interesting note that the people involved in writing the poll questions were Michael Sfard, who's well known probably to most of you in the room. He's an active NGO activist here on his very, very extreme political views on certain things, and also Alon Liel and other members of that activist community were involved in writing these poll questions. So you didn't also see any critical analysis in the media of, why were these people qualified to write poll questions? What was the motivations behind their poll? Another great example, and I will say that there was one journalist who did not follow this line, and that was Jodi Rudorin of the New York Times. She was actually the only international journalist who didn't write about the story, and basically on her Twitter account, in response to someone asking about the poll, said, "Read closely, it's a push poll." Now in her case, I find it interesting because we subsequently found out that she actually went to the New Israel Fund, which funded the organization that conducted this poll, and asked them what they thought about the poll, and they actually were very critical of the poll. But again, so here you also see an example where she herself did not go to the actual source materials. She went to another NGO to find out what her take should be on this poll. Another great example of this we've seen recently. Well, and also I'll just show, in terms of the corrections which were mentioned, if you look in the Hebrew version, the word apartheid is still in that version. And also Gidon Levy's apology for the mistakes made, I found pretty half-hearted. But the important point to make about these corrections also is that though they were in Haaretz, none of these international media outlets that had adopted this NGO poll and their spin on the questions, which completely twisted around the results, none of them have issued a correction. So out in the public domain now, you may have these corrections which weren't, so clear, I would say, on Haaretz's website or in the actual printed paper, but you don't see that anywhere else that this article appears. And the results of that, we've already heard examples of members of the Presbyterian Church community have been circulating these articles around California, calling as proof of why there needs to be boycotts against Israel, about why there needs to be U.S. military aid cut off to Israel. So these types of things in journalism, in the media, when there isn't this critical analysis, have very real-world impacts. Another great example was 2 weeks ago, an NGO called Gisha, which is very active on the issue of Gaza, had done a Freedom of Information Act request to the military, and a few weeks ago received a document from 2008 which purported to explain the IDF's policy in terms of what it was allowing in and out of Gaza. But the one thing that was picked up by everyone in the media about this document was that the IDF, in a draft, had looked to calorie needs of people, and that they were maybe going to use that as a determinant of how much aid they were going to let into Gaza. So what happened? This story actually was even a bigger story than the apartheid poll story. There were 356 news reports on it. So you have headlines in The Guardian: Israel used calorie count to limit Gaza food. Israel calculated calorie needs for embargoed Gazans. Israel set calorie red line. Now, what's amazing to me about this story, this is about a document from almost 5 years ago now. It was a draft document, and the IDF says they never implemented this policy. So here you have the story exploding like wildfire across the media, and it was something that was never even implemented. And not only that, what was being done was nothing negative. The calorie amounts that they were talking about were far exceeded anyone's requirements. And this is the type of metric used by humanitarian organizations all over the world, and even UNRWA uses this type of metric when determining how much aid they need to supply to Palestinian refugees. So again, this wasn't anything bad, and it was actually something that was never implemented, yet here it was spread all over the international media. Another way in which NGOs influence the media, and it's not reported on so much, is there's a lot, especially in this region, I'm not sure if it's an issue elsewhere, there's a lot of fluidity between the staffing of NGOs and journalists. People move in from being journalists to working with advocacy organizations and vice versa. Two very interesting examples of this. A current reporter for the New York Times named Faris Akram used to be a researcher for Human Rights Watch. Now, often in his stories from Gaza, he cites the Human Rights Watch as a source. Or the story itself will be about Human Rights Watch. He wrote a story about them a few weeks ago. But in these stories, he never mentions that he used to work for them. So that's a significant conflict of interest that he's not disclosing. It doesn't necessarily mean that he can't be an objective reporter on those issues, but it's something that the public needs to know. Another great example, the press representative for the Corey family, Rachel Corey family, also used to be a researcher at Human Rights Watch. And she also happens to be married to the Time magazine correspondent here, Carl Vick. And when you looked at a lot of the news reporting when the Corey verdict came out at the end of August, many of them adopted HRW's spin on the verdict. And I would add that much of the media in writing their reports really seemed to rely on HRW's report or press points put out by this woman who used to work for HRW. And there was no analysis of the actual verdict itself. It was a 60-page document issued in Hebrew, but rather than taking the time to review the verdict, to analyze the facts of the case, instead what most of the international media did was simply adopt these points, these talking points, claiming, things we've all heard before: Israel impunity, war crimes, and similar type claims. Another issue that is a result of the halo effect, and which also impacts a lot on the media reporting in this region, but also elsewhere, and touches on what Raphael was speaking about earlier, is that there are few fact-finding methodologies in place for NGOs that engage in making claims about armed conflict. And that's a significant problem. Now, pretty much since the end of the Cold War, many prominent NGOs, and Amnesty International is one, Human Rights Watch, needed to find a way to maintain their influence once the Cold War ended. And so many of them sort of restyled themselves as experts in armed conflict, military operations, international law. And so now we see a lot more reporting on armed conflict, and we'll see claims like claiming expertise on military necessity, claims on whether attacks were disproportionate or indiscriminate, or on certain types of weapons used and whether they were the correct weapons to be used. And this was very significant in the reporting by those organizations, in particular during the Lebanon conflict in 2006, as well as the 2009 Gaza war. And here's just a few examples of how some of those NGO claims became adopted in the media. Amnesty: Israel killed hundreds of civilians in Gaza. Here are some examples where NGOs are relied upon for military expertise. And one, I'd say, emblematic example of this is the operation in Qana at the end of July in 2006, which was really a seminal event in the war. Basically, there was an Israeli operation. Just to remind you, there had been some shooting of rockets from the village, either within or in the vicinity of Qana. The Israeli military did an airstrike there, and there were civilians killed in a particular building. But what Human Rights Watch did immediately after that happened, issued a press release that 54 to 63 people were killed, and they based their information solely on the testimony of one woman whose ties to Hezbollah were unknown. And they did this even though they knew that the Lebanese Red Cross had also issued a statement that day saying that the casualties were 28, so half of what HRW was reporting. But as Marvin Kalb of Harvard and his colleagues put out in a study in 2007, most of the media coverage used the higher of the two estimates because it was more sensational. And again, that incident had a significant impact on the war. Up until that point, there was, I wouldn't say international support for the war, but certainly people were not going after Israel in the international, the diplomatic community. There was some level of support for what Israel was doing, but this was sort of the turning point. It led to a ceasefire, and really it led to the cessation of the war a couple of weeks later, even though many have argued that that might not have been the best time to do so. So again, we see that is a significant example, but it's not just in the Middle East. Other researchers have shown similar problems in Colombia. For instance, there was a study from the University of London where they found that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch often did not have systematic research approaches to their work there. They would use inconsistent legal claims. They would often underreport crimes by the paramilitaries, and their work expressed a bias against the government. And we found the same thing in our work. We recently published a book on best practices for human rights NGO fact-finding. We have the flyer outside where we go into and we examine a lot of these cases. But we find the same thing here in terms of using the term human shielding. Human Rights Watch will often use a much narrower definition of human shielding here than it does in Sri Lanka or other conflicts. So basically, just to sum up, because I believe I'm out of time, basically, the media, in order to restore its gatekeeping and filtering role, really needs to start taking a critical approach to how NGO reports are used by them in their reporting. They need to take the same skeptical approach to these organizations, just as they would to a government organization. It's inconceivable that a journalist would take a claim from the Israeli government, for instance, and not do any sort of checking of that or verification or looking to other sources to balance that out. And they need to do the same thing with their approach to non-governmental organizations. They need to critically examine why they have this halo effect and how it's impacting on their reporting. And once that happens, then perhaps they can restore their role as a gatekeeper and filter, as mentioned by Dr. Sonnet. So thanks very much.